My husband died in a sudden tragic accident, and for our entire marriage, he strictly forbade me from ever visiting his private island. After his funeral, I finally went. His lawyer had warned me not to go, saying I would not like what I found. I ignored him. But the moment I bypassed the security and stepped into that underground bunker, I could not breathe. Because that is when I finally understood exactly why he kept it secret and who he really was. My name is Clara, 34 years old, and I am a forensic accountant. I stood shivering in the biting October wind, clutching a handful of damp earth. The mahogany casket holding my husband Nolan had just been lowered into the ground. I was completely numb. We had been married for 5 years, and I thought we were building a life together. I raised my hand to toss the dirt into the grave, a final goodbye, when something hard jammed into my chest. I stumbled back, dropping the earth onto my black heels. My sister-in-law Rebecca stood glaring at me, her eyes completely devoid of grief. She shoved a thick, legally bound document into my hands. It was an emergency injunction. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to deal with entitled in-laws who showed their true colors the moment tragedy struck. Trust me, you will want to hear how I handled the ultimate betrayal. I stared down at the legal papers, the rain starting to smudge the ink. I looked up at Rebecca, completely baffled. I asked her what she was doing. We were standing right over her brother's grave. Rebecca sneered, adjusting her designer black veil. She told me that tears would not pay the massive mortgage I had been leeching off her brother for years. She demanded the master passcode to his digital safe right there on the spot, threatening to have me evicted by nightfall if I refused to cooperate. Her voice was loud enough for the other mourners to hear. My mother-in-law Beatrice stood a few feet away beneath a large black umbrella, watching the scene with a cold, satisfied smirk on her face. They were trying to humiliate me in front of everyone we knew. I wiped the cold rain from my cheek and squared my shoulders. I refused to let them break me. I looked Rebecca dead in the eye and reminded her of reality. I told her that I was the one who paid that mortgage. As a senior forensic accountant, my salary kept the lights on, the bills paid, and the fridge stocked, while Nolan spent the last 3 years finding himself and launching failed startup after failed startup. I was the financial backbone of our home. Nolan never had a steady income, and his family knew it. They just hated acknowledging that a working-class girl like me was the one supporting their precious golden boy. Rebecca's face turned red with anger. She opened her mouth to scream at me, but a large hand gently pulled her back. It was her husband, Jamal. Jamal was an imposing African-American man who worked as an elite investment broker in Manhattan. He was always dressed impeccably, and today was no exception. He wore a custom-tailored bespoke suit that probably cost more than my car. Jamal stepped forward, blocking my view of Rebecca. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice. He leaned in close, bringing the scent of expensive cologne and sheer arrogance into my personal space. He smiled down at me with a look of pure condescension. Jamal whispered quietly so only I could hear. He told me that my accounting salary meant absolutely nothing in their world. He informed me with a sickeningly calm voice that as of 20 minutes ago, he had used his connections to freeze every single joint credit card, bank account, and line of credit tied to my name. He said I was entirely cut off. He warned me that if I did not hand over the digital safe codes by the time I got back to the house, I would be sleeping on the street with zero assets. My heart hammered in my chest. Before I could process the sheer cruelty of Jamal's financial ambush, my cell phone began vibrating frantically in my coat pocket. I pulled it out, my hands trembling from the cold and the shock. The caller ID flashed the name of Nolan's private wealth attorney, Mr. Gallagher. I answered the call, expecting condolences. Instead, the lawyer's voice was panicked and breathless. He told me to get away from the family immediately. He warned me to leave the cemetery right now, get in my car and drive because my life was in imminent danger. I slammed my car door shut, locked it, and shoved the key into the ignition. My tires spun against the wet gravel of the cemetery driveway as I accelerated away from the gravesite, leaving Jamal, Rebecca, and Beatrice standing in the rain. I threw my phone onto the passenger seat and put Mr. Gallagher on speaker. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I demanded to know what he meant about my life being in danger. Mr. Gallagher sounded completely frantic, his voice cracking over the car's stereo. He told me that Jamal had just forced his firm to execute Nolan's will early. They bypassed the standard waiting period, using some high-level corporate legal loophole Jamal orchestrated through his investment firm. Mr. Gallagher said the family was moving to liquidate and take control of everything today. I told him that was impossible, that Nolan and I had shared assets. I yelled at the phone, reminding the lawyer that I was the one who paid for our house. Mr. Gallagher cut me off. He said the house did not matter right now. He told me to listen carefully because he did not have much time. He said there was one specific asset not listed anywhere in the primary estate documents. It was a property Nolan had kept entirely off the books, hidden behind layers of dummy corporations. Gallagher said that as Nolan's legal wife, this unlisted asset would automatically default to me by state law the moment the will was read. Then his tone turned deadly serious. He told me that under no circumstances could I accept it. He said I had to sign a formal renunciation document immediately. If I claimed ownership of this property, he warned I would not just lose my career, I would go to federal prison. I slammed on the brakes as a truck swerved in front of me, my heart pounding in my throat. I asked him what kind of asset could possibly send me to prison. I reminded him of my profession. I told him I was a forensic accountant, that I tracked hidden money for a living, and that I knew every single dime that came in and out of my husband's accounts. There was no way Nolan could hide something that massive from me. Mr. Gallagher let out a heavy sigh. His next words chilled me to the bone. He said I had spent the last 5 years of my life auditing massive corporate frauds, but I had made one fatal mistake. I should have audited my own husband. He told me to stay away from Blackwood Island. The name hit me like a physical blow. Blackwood Island. It was a barren strip of rock off the eastern coast. Nolan had bought it years ago, long before we were married, claiming it was a terrible real estate investment he regretted. Whenever I brought it up or offered to look at the tax liabilities for the land, Nolan would become defensive and angry. He explicitly forbade me from ever going there, saying the terrain was dangerous and the waters were treacherous. Now his lawyer was telling me this worthless rock was the center of a criminal conspiracy. I demanded more answers, but Mr. Gallagher refused to speak further. He said he was worried his office phones were already compromised by Jamal's people. He instructed me to go straight home, pack a small bag of essentials, and come to his downtown office through the underground parking garage. He promised to have the renunciation papers ready. Before I could ask another question, the line went dead. I threw the phone down and focused on the road. The rain was coming down in sheets now. Jamal had already frozen my credit cards and wiped out my access to our joint checking accounts. I was essentially penniless, driving a car that Jamal would probably try to repossess by tomorrow. But Jamal did not know everything. I had a hidden emergency cash fund inside my home office safe, along with my encrypted work laptop. That laptop contained the military-grade auditing software I used for my federal investigations. If Nolan was hiding illegal activity, I could use my software to tear his financial history apart and find the truth. I turned into my affluent, quiet suburban neighborhood, my mind racing with a plan. I just needed 5 minutes inside my house to grab my drive, the cash, and a change of clothes. But as I turned the corner and approached my driveway, my stomach dropped. A massive black luxury SUV was parked right across the bottom of my driveway, blocking the entrance completely. I parked my car on the street a few houses down and sprinted through the pouring rain across my front lawn. I ran up the steps to my large oak front door and shoved my house key into the lock. It refused to turn. I pulled it out and tried again, my hands shaking. The deadbolt had been entirely replaced. The locks were changed. Suddenly, the heavy front door swung open from the inside. The warmth of my own home spilled out onto the freezing porch, but the sight before me froze my blood. Beatrice, my mother-in-law, stood perfectly poised in my foyer. She was casually sipping from my favorite ceramic tea mug, Standing squarely on either side of her, blocking the entire doorway, were two massive private security guards dressed in black tactical gear. Beatrice took a slow sip of her tea, looked at me, standing soaking wet on my own porch, and smiled a cold, victorious smile. I stood frozen on the porch, the icy rain soaking through my black morning dress. Beatrice took another leisurely sip of her tea, looking at me like I was a stray animal that had wandered onto her pristine property. I demanded that she step aside and let me into my own home. I told her my name was on the deed, and she had no legal right to lock me out. Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed in the foyer. She told me I was profoundly naive. She gestured to the two massive guards in tactical gear standing beside her. She explained that Jamal's firm now held the deed to this house, having quietly bought out the debt Nolan accumulated behind my back. Beatrice stepped closer to the threshold, her expression hardening into absolute disgust. She asked me if I honestly thought marrying Nolan had ever made me one of them. She told me I was nothing but a working-class charity case from the wrong side of the tracks. She said I was a convenient free accountant for his endless string of failed startups. She gloated that Nolan never loved me, that I was simply a utility to balance their books and maintain his lifestyle while he prepared to take over the family legacy. She told me to turn around, walk away, and accept my place at the bottom of the food chain where I belonged. The sheer venom in her words took my breath away. 5 years of marriage, 5 years of paying their bills, and playing the supportive wife, all reduced to a calculated financial strategy. But the shock quickly morphed into a burning razor-sharp anger. I knew I could not physically overpower the two heavily armed guards blocking the door. I needed to use my brain. I needed my encrypted hard drive, which was locked in my home office at the back of the house. I slipped my hand deep into my coat pocket and wrapped my fingers tightly around my car key fob. I took a deliberate step backward, looking defeated. I told Beatrice she could keep the house, but I needed my work laptop. She smiled and signaled the guards to close the heavy oak door in my face. The moment the latch clicked, I pressed the red panic button on my key fob. A deafening siren erupted down the street. The piercing wail of my car alarm sliced through the heavy rain. I heard shouts from inside the house as the two guards scrambled, likely thinking it was the police or a security breach. I did not waste a single second. I sprinted off the porch and dashed through the side gate, my heels sinking into the muddy lawn. I ran toward the back of the house where my office patio doors were located. Through the glass, I could see the guards rushing toward the front windows. I grabbed a heavy cast-iron garden gnome from the flower bed, raised it above my head, and hurled it straight through the sliding glass door. The glass shattered with a deafening crash. I carefully stepped through the jagged frame, ignoring a sharp cut on my calf, and darted straight for the hidden floor safe beneath my desk. My fingers flew across the keypad, entering the combination I had memorized years ago. The heavy metal door popped open. I grabbed my thick waterproof go bag, which contained my encrypted backup drive, my passport, and a stack of emergency cash. I could hear heavy boots pounding down the hallway toward the office. The guards had realized the alarm was a diversion. I scrambled back through the shattered patio door just as one of the guards burst into the room shouting. I bolted across the backyard, hopped the low wooden fence, and sprinted down the alleyway toward where I had parked my car. My lungs burned and the rain blinded me, but I kept running until I reached my vehicle. I hit the unlock button, threw myself into the driver's seat, and locked the doors just as the guards rounded the corner of the street. I slammed the car into gear and sped away, leaving my neighborhood behind in a blur of wet asphalt and flashing streetlights. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I drove frantically for 10 minutes before pulling into the dark, empty parking garage of a closed shopping mall. I needed to know exactly what Jamal and Nolan had done. I unzipped the go bag, pulled out my encrypted hard drive, and connected it directly to the dashboard interface of my car. I booted up my forensic accounting software, praying that my network access had not been completely severed. The screen glowed blue in the dark cabin, lines of code processing rapidly. Then the screen flashed a violent, blinding red. A massive alert notification popped up. $40 million had just been routed through my personal professional credentials to an offshore holding company. They had not just stolen my money, they had framed me for federal wire fraud. I stared at the blinding red notification on my dashboard screen. $40 million. They had not just locked me out of my house and emptied my bank accounts. Jamal and Nolan had actively forged my digital credentials to launder a fortune, leaving a perfect paper trail pointing directly at me. If the federal authorities saw this, I would be facing decades in a maximum security prison. I slammed the laptop shut, shoved it back into my waterproof bag, and threw my car into drive. I needed to get to Mr. Gallagher's downtown law office immediately. I had to know exactly how deep this trap went. I navigated the slick, rain-washed streets of the financial district, following the lawyer's previous instructions to bypass the main lobby. I drove straight into the underground parking garage of the high-rise building, took the private service elevator, and walked directly into the mahogany-paneled conference room. The air inside the room was thick with tension. Mr. Gallagher sat at the head of the massive glass table, pale and sweating profusely, shuffling through a stack of legal documents. Sitting across from him, looking entirely too comfortable, were Jamal, Rebecca, and Beatrice. Jamal had already changed into a fresh charcoal gray suit, looking completely unbothered by the fact that he had just ambushed a grieving widow at a cemetery. Rebecca was casually sipping sparkling water with lemon, checking her manicure. I walked in dripping wet, my clothes plastered to my skin, clutching my bag to my chest. Beatrice rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath about tracking mud onto the expensive carpet. I ignored her and took the seat furthest away from them, locking my eyes on the lawyer. I told him to read the will. Mr. Gallagher cleared his throat, avoiding my gaze. He began reading the official declarations, and with every sentence he spoke, the absolute scale of Nolan's betrayal became clearer. Nolan had legally transferred every single liquid asset, his entire investment portfolio, and the controlling shares of his technology startup directly to Rebecca and Beatrice. He had also left them the mainland estate, the very house I had paid the mortgage on for the last 5 years. I was left with absolutely nothing of value. Rebecca set her water glass down on the table, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. She looked at me, her eyes gleaming with malice. She noted how tragic it was that I had wasted my entire 30s building Nolan's business. She mocked me openly, saying I spent the best years of my life balancing his books, paying for his mistakes, and funding his dreams, only to be left holding an empty bag. She laughed and told me I was never an equal partner in my marriage, but merely a temporary unpaid employee who had finally been fired. I gripped the edge of the glass table, biting the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. But Mr. Gallagher was not finished. He nervously flipped to the final page of the document and wiped his brow with a handkerchief. He announced that there was one final corporate entity attached to Nolan's estate. It was a shell company registered entirely in my name as a spousal guarantor. Because Nolan was dead, the debt attached to that shell company was now my sole legal responsibility. I demanded to know the amount. Mr. Gallagher swallowed hard and whispered that it was $2 million. Rebecca let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Beatrice smiled and smoothed the skirt of her black dress. They had thoroughly destroyed my life. I was penniless, homeless, framed for a $40 million federal crime, and now legally saddled with $2 million of fabricated debt. I looked at Jamal. He was sitting completely still, his dark eyes locked onto me, watching my reaction like a predator observing a wounded animal. He was waiting for me to break down, to cry, or to beg. I did none of those things. I took a slow, deep breath, calculating my next move. Then, Mr. Gallagher reached into his leather briefcase. His hands were shaking visibly. He pulled out a thick, unmarked black envelope and placed it carefully on the table. He slid it across the smooth glass until it stopped right in front of me. He spoke in a hushed, terrified tone. He explained that despite all the transfers, there was one unlisted asset that Nolan had failed to secure in the trust. As his legal spouse, the deed to Blackwood Island defaulted entirely to me. Before I could even touch the black envelope, Jamal suddenly leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The smugness vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, aggressive intensity. He told me not to open it. He said he had an alternative offer. Jamal's heavy hand slammed down on top of the black envelope before my fingers could even brush the paper. His polished, civilized demeanor vanished instantly, shifting into something highly predatory and deeply calculating. He turned his head slightly and told Mr. Gallagher to step outside. The lawyer did not argue. He grabbed his briefcase and practically sprinted out of the conference room, pulling the heavy glass doors shut behind him. I was now completely alone with my in-laws. Jamal unbuttoned his suit jacket, reached into his own leather briefcase, and pulled out a sleek, cream-colored folder. He tossed the folder onto the glass table and slid it precisely across the surface until it stopped right in front of me. I looked down. Inside was a certified cashier's check made out to my name. The amount was exactly $500,000. Next to the check was a dense multi-page legal contract. Jamal leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers, and adopted the smooth, manipulative cadence he used to close multi-million-dollar acquisitions on Wall Street. He looked at me with faux sympathy. He said, "Be smart, Clara. You are a numbers girl. You understand basic economics and risk assessment better than anyone. Take the $500,000, pay off the debt Nolan left you, and walk away with your life intact." He pointed a long finger at the black envelope still trapped under his other hand, claiming that Blackwood Island was nothing but a barren strip of toxic rocks. Jamal spun a highly detailed, terrifying lie. He told me the island was an environmental liability, citing fake EPA fines, unstable shorelines, and massive commercial property tax liens that would completely bankrupt me by the end of the fiscal year. He said his investment firm specialized in acquiring distressed assets and mitigating corporate losses. According to him, he was doing me a massive favor by taking this toxic wasteland off my hands. Rebecca chimed in, swirling the lemon slice in her sparkling water. She told me Jamal was being incredibly generous, offering me charity out of the goodness of his heart after I had embarrassed their family at the cemetery. Beatrice nodded in solemn agreement, staring at me with cold, unblinking eyes. She told me to take the money and go back to the cheap apartment I rented before I tricked her son into marrying me. They were trying to box me in using a carefully orchestrated mix of financial terror and false salvation to force my hand. Jamal pulled a heavy gold fountain pen from his breast pocket and set it down firmly on top of the contract. He told me his firm was willing to absorb the island's liabilities and wipe my slate clean, but only if I signed the transfer of ownership right that second. He demanded I sign the property over to his private investment group, completely bypassing the estate probate process. If I refused, he promised to unleash his corporate legal team to ensure I went to federal prison for the $2 million shell company debt. He crossed his arms and told me I had exactly 1 minute to decide my entire future. I looked at the cashier's check, then at the heavy gold pen, and finally at the legal contract. As a forensic accountant, my eyes were trained to automatically scan for discrepancies, missing clauses, and hidden traps. You do not survive 5 years of auditing corporate fraud without learning to read the fine print first. I knew nobody hands over $500,000 for toxic rocks. I ignored the signature line at the bottom and looked straight at the header of the document. I scanned past the dense legal jargon, past the registered name of Jamal's investment firm, and landed on the notary seal and the document preparation metadata printed faintly in the top right corner. My blood turned to ice. The breath caught in my throat, and the sterile, climate-controlled air of the conference room suddenly felt suffocating. I stared at the preparation date typed clearly in black ink. The document transferring my rights as a widow to Jamal's firm had been drafted, finalized, and notarized exactly 3 days before Nolan's car crashed into that concrete barrier. I looked up slowly, meeting Jamal's dark, expectant gaze. He was waiting for me to break, waiting for me to pick up the pen and surrender, but my mind was racing with a terrifying, undeniable truth. You do not draft a widow's asset transfer before the husband is actually dead, unless you already know the husband is not going to survive the week. The $40 million frame job, the sudden early execution of the will, the aggressive, desperate push for this supposedly worthless island. It all snapped into brutal focus. Nolan's death was not a tragic accident. Jamal knew Nolan was going to die. I pushed the cream-colored folder back across the mahogany table, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I told Jamal I was not signing anything. I told him I saw the notary stamp, I saw the preparation date, and I knew exactly what he did. I told him I knew he was fully aware Nolan was going to die 3 days before the crash even happened. Jamal's confident corporate smirk vanished instantly. His face contorted into a mask of pure rage. He lunged across the glass table to grab my arm, knocking over Rebecca's glass of sparkling water. But I was faster. I snatched the thick black envelope containing the unlisted deed to Blackwood Island and shoved it deep into my wet coat pocket. I backed away toward the heavy double doors. Rebecca screamed at me, calling me a crazy, paranoid witch, while Beatrice stood up demanding I leave the property documents on the table. I did not waste another second arguing with the people who had orchestrated my husband's death. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and sprinted down the carpeted hallway. I heard Jamal shouting behind me, threatening to completely destroy my life, but I kept running until I reached the service elevator and slammed the close button. I made it back to my car, my hands shaking violently as I gripped the leather steering wheel. I was entirely on my own now. Jamal was not just trying to steal my assets to cover his firm's bad investments. He was actively involved in my husband's fatal accident. I needed cash immediately. I knew Jamal had already frozen my credit cards and joint checking accounts, but I had one last lifeline. I had a private safety deposit box and a separate emergency cash fund at a small regional bank branch downtown. I had set it up years ago, long before Nolan and I were ever married. If I could just get that cash, I could disappear, hire an independent private investigator, and expose Jamal's entire deadly operation. I drove to the branch parked a block away to avoid drawing attention and walked into the quiet, marble-floored lobby. The bank was practically empty due to the severe storm outside. I approached the teller window and handed over my private account card and my state driver's license. I asked the young woman behind the counter to withdraw my entire balance in cash and requested immediate access to my safety deposit box. The teller smiled politely and swiped my card. Her fingers paused on the keyboard. Her smile faded. She stared intently at her computer monitor, her eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror. She looked up at me, swallowed hard, and slowly moved her right hand beneath the counter. I knew exactly what that subtle movement meant. She was pressing the silent panic button. I asked her what was wrong, keeping my voice as steady as possible. She stammered, telling me to wait just one moment, and practically ran to the back office. A minute later, the branch manager walked out. He was an older man I had known for years. He had always been friendly, but today he would not even make eye contact with me. He stood safely behind the thick bulletproof glass of the teller station and spoke to me in a hushed, nervous voice. He told me he was incredibly sorry. He said he could not give me my money and he was legally barred from allowing me access to my safety deposit box. I demanded to know if Jamal had called them to interfere. The manager shook his head grimly. He said this had absolutely nothing to do with my family. He told me the federal government had just seized every single account tied to my social security number, including my professional business accounts. He leaned closer to the glass and whispered that the seizure order came directly from the authorities, citing massive wire fraud and federal embezzlement. The floor felt like it was dropping out from under my feet. The $40 million transfer I had seen flashing red on my car dashboard suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. They had not just stolen the money, they had routed the entire fortune directly through my professional forensic accounting credentials. Jamal and Nolan had used my pristine career, my federal clearance, and my secure digital signature to authorize the illegal offshore transfers. My own professional license was being used as the ultimate weapon to destroy me. I was the perfect fall guy. I was a grieving widow suddenly drowning in $2 million of debt with $40 million of missing corporate funds attached directly to her name. I backed away from the teller window, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The manager told me he had to follow strict legal protocol and asked me to stay exactly where I was. I turned around to look at the front entrance of the bank. Two tall men wearing dark sunglasses and navy blue windbreakers had just walked through the revolving glass doors. I recognized the severe tactical way they scanned the lobby. They were federal agents. One of them locked eyes with me from across the room and reached inside his jacket, pulling out a gold badge. I did not hesitate. I turned on my heel, bolted down the side corridor past the empty loan offices, and slammed my body against the emergency fire exit door. The alarm blared instantly as I spilled out into the pouring rain of the back alley, running for my life. I kept running down the alley, my lungs burning as the freezing rain lashed against my face. I could hear the faint, high-pitched wail of police sirens starting to echo through the downtown financial district. I knew the bank manager had triggered a priority federal alarm, and the FBI agents inside the lobby would have my description broadcasted to every patrol car in the city within minutes. I reached my vehicle parked a block away, threw my waterproof bag onto the passenger seat, and sped out of the area, taking narrow side streets to avoid the main traffic cameras. I knew they would put a tracker on my license plate shortly. I needed to ditch the car and find a place to hide where no one would ask questions. I drove toward the dilapidated industrial outskirts of the city, parked the car behind an abandoned strip mall, and grabbed my bag. I walked for over a mile in the pouring storm, keeping my head down until I found a cheap roadside motel with a flickering neon vacancy sign. I walked into the dingy lobby, soaking wet and shivering violently. I pulled a stack of emergency cash from my bag and slapped it onto the scratched laminate counter. I did not offer a name or an identification card. The clerk, an older man watching a portable television, did not ask for one. He simply slid a rusted brass key across the counter and pointed toward the back of the property. I found my room, stepped inside, and slammed the door. I locked the deadbolt, threw the heavy metal safety latch, and pulled the stained curtains tightly shut. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke, mildew, and cheap bleach, but it was a fortress for the moment. I did not even bother changing out of my wet clothes. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, unzipped my bag, and pulled out my encrypted hard drive and my laptop. It was time to stop running and do what I do best. I was going to tear my dead husband's financial history apart line by line. I plugged the drive in and booted up my proprietary forensic accounting software. The screen illuminated the dark, grimy room with a harsh blue glow. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I bypassed the standard public networks and initiated a deep packet inspection of the routing numbers the bank manager had mentioned. I began muttering to myself as the lines of code, transaction logs, and wire transfer receipts scrolled rapidly across the screen. I was piecing together the entire timeline of their massive betrayal. I whispered to the empty room, analyzing the data map that revealed a deeply complex web of corporate layering. Jamal's high-end investment firm had been bleeding money for years. He was hiding catastrophic losses from his wealthy Wall Street clients to cover the massive deficit Jamal needed to wash millions in illicit funds. He partnered with Nolan. Nolan set up the shell company, the exact one I was now legally responsible for, to act as a silent funnel for the dirty money. But they had a major problem. They needed a pristine, federally licensed auditor to sign off on the transfers, so the IRS would not immediately flag the massive influx of cash. I gritted my teeth as I uncovered the authorization logs. They had not just forged my name on a piece of paper. They had stolen my secure digital signature. I spoke aloud, my voice trembling with a mixture of profound heartbreak and absolute rage. You cloned my biometric login token, Nolan. You used the nights I worked late, the nights I exhausted myself paying your bills and supporting your dreams to log into my professional portal. You sat in our home and approved $40 million in fraudulent wire transfers while I was sleeping in the next room. You made me the architect of your federal crime. The software was still running, executing a reverse wire trace to find the final destination of the stolen $40 million. Usually, in money laundering cases of this magnitude, the funds are fragmented into dozens of microtransactions and blasted across international borders. I fully expected the money to be sitting in a numbered account, protected by strict banking secrecy laws in Geneva, or hidden in a corporate trust in the Cayman Islands. I initiated a geolocation ping on the receiving IP address, waiting for the global map on my screen to populate. The progress bar hit 100%. The screen flashed bright green, signaling a successful and complete trace, but the digital map did not zoom out to the Caribbean or Europe. It zoomed in. The final destination IP address was not an offshore bank account at all. It was a private, highly localized server network. I stared at the blinking red dot on the screen, my blood turning to ice. The server was physically located just a few miles off the eastern coast. It was pinging directly from Blackwood Island, the exact same island Nolan had ruthlessly forbidden me from ever visiting. I stared at the blinking red dot on the screen for only a few seconds before I slammed the laptop shut. The digital trail was not enough. In a federal court, a high-priced defense attorney could easily argue that my computer had been hacked remotely or spoofed by an unknown third party. I needed hard physical evidence. I needed to extract the data from the actual server hardware on Blackwood Island, and I needed to do it before Jamal realized I had successfully traced the money. I packed my bag, left the motel key on the bed, and walked out into the freezing rain. The storm had worsened into a full-blown nor'easter. The wind was howling, tearing branches from the trees along the highway and whipping the rain into horizontal sheets. I drove my car toward the coastal marina, staying exactly at the speed limit so I would not get pulled over by a passing patrol car. The marina was mostly deserted when I arrived. The sky was the color of bruised iron, and the ocean looked like a boiling cauldron of black water. Boats were tied down tightly, violently, bobbing against the wooden docks and groaning under the strain of the heavy wind. I spotted a small, dimly lit bait and tackle shop that doubled as a boat rental office at the end of the pier. I pulled the hood of my coat over my head and walked inside. The shop smelled strongly of diesel fuel, salt, and old coffee. Behind the counter stood a grizzled, heavily bearded dock worker wearing a bright yellow rain slicker. He was staring intensely at a small, boxy television mounted high in the corner of the room. I walked up to the counter, pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills from my waterproof bag, and told him I needed to rent a motorized skiff immediately. He did not look at the money. He did not look at me. He just kept staring at the television screen. I followed his gaze, and my stomach plummeted straight to the floor. The local news channel was broadcasting a breaking news alert. A massive photograph of my face filled the entire screen. The scrolling ticker at the bottom read, "Local accountant wanted by federal authorities in $40 million embezzlement case following husband's tragic death." I froze. My hand instinctively reached for the heavy iron fire extinguisher resting against the wall nearby. I prepared to fight my way out of the shop if he reached for the phone to call the authorities. The dock worker slowly turned his head and looked directly at me. He looked at the television, then back at me. He slowly reached his hand under the counter. I braced myself, my muscles tensed and ready to run. Instead of a phone or a weapon, he pulled out a set of rusted boat keys attached to a bright orange float. He tossed them onto the scratched wooden counter right next to my stack of cash. He leaned forward, his dark eyes studying my face in the dim light. He told me he knew exactly who I was. He said he recognized my face from the news, but more importantly, he knew my brother-in-law, Jamal. He spat the name out like it was pure poison. He told me Jamal's fancy Manhattan investment firm had bought out his Maritime Union pension fund 3 years ago. Jamal and his corporate vultures had systematically drained the fund, declared bankruptcy, and left hundreds of hardworking dock workers with absolutely nothing to retire on. The dock worker pushed my money back toward me. He told me Jamal destroyed his life and stole his retirement, and he would be damned if he helped the federal government protect a wealthy thief like that. He pointed a calloused finger at the keys. He told me to take the aluminum skiff tied to slip number 4. He assured me it had a full tank of gas and a reinforced hull. Then his expression turned grim. He asked me where I was planning to go in a massive storm like this. When I told him Blackwood Island, the color drained from his weathered face. He shook his head slowly. He warned me that Blackwood was a dead zone. He said nobody ever goes out there and the people who try never come back. He told me the waters around the island were filled with jagged rocks hidden just below the surface, specifically designed by nature to tear a boat to pieces. I thanked him, grabbed the keys, and ran out the door. I found the skiff, untied the heavy mooring lines, and jumped in. I started the outboard motor and it roared to life over the sound of the crashing waves. I steered the small boat out of the protected harbor and straight into the raging storm. The ocean was terrifying. 10-foot swells slammed into the aluminum hull, tossing the skiff around like a child's toy. Freezing salt water rained down on me, soaking me to the bone, but I kept my eyes locked on the dark silhouette of the island in the distance. I pushed the throttle forward, fighting the massive currents with everything I had. Every time the boat crashed down into a trough, I thought the hull would crack open. But I refused to turn back. I had to get to that server. I was about halfway to the island, fighting to keep the bow pointed into the wind, when the absolute darkness around me suddenly vanished. A blinding high-intensity beam of white light sliced through the heavy rain. It swept rapidly across the violent water, lighting up the cresting waves like white fire, and then stopped. It locked directly onto my small boat, trapping me in a blinding circle of light. I raised my arm to shield my eyes. I was entirely exposed out on the open water. Someone was patrolling the forbidden waters and they had just found me. The blinding white light pinned me like a physical weight against the dark, churning ocean. Over the deafening roar of the storm, a heavily amplified voice boomed from a marine loudspeaker. The voice ordered me to cut my engine immediately and prepare to be boarded. I squinted through the freezing rain and saw the massive dark hull of a tactical security speedboat tearing through the waves directly behind me. It was easily 3 times the size of my small aluminum skiff, equipped with twin high-performance engines that chewed through the rough water with terrifying ease. It was closing the distance fast. I knew that if they caught me out here in the middle of a massive storm, Jamal would make sure I simply disappeared. I would be just another tragic casualty of the weather, a desperate fugitive who drowned running from the law. I refused to let them win. I shoved the throttle forward, maxing out the tiny outboard motor. The skiff lurched, slamming violently against the crest of a massive swell, but I was losing ground by the second. I desperately scanned the dark horizon of Blackwood Island ahead. The old dockworker had warned me about the jagged rocks, hidden just beneath the surface, a natural fortress that tore boats to shreds. Through the blinding rain and the sweeping beam of the spotlight, I spotted a narrow, treacherous inlet flanked by towering black stone spires. The water inside was a boiling nightmare of cross-currents and white foam, but it was incredibly shallow and tight. The massive security boat pursuing me had a deep fiberglass draft. If they tried to follow me through that narrow gap, their hull would be torn to pieces. It was a complete suicide run, but it was my only option. I violently cranked the outboard tiller, aiming the bow of the skiff directly toward the deadly inlet. As the boat careened toward the jagged rocks, a chilling memory flashed in my mind. It was 2 years ago during a rare weekend trip to the coast. We were having dinner, and I had found an old maritime map. I innocently pointed to this exact inlet, suggesting we rent a boat and explore the hidden coves around his property. Nolan had completely lost his mind. He had lunged across the dinner table and violently grabbed my wrist, his fingers digging so deeply into my skin that it left dark bruises for a week. His eyes had burned with an uncharacteristic, terrifying rage that left me shaking. He yelled at me to never go there. He lied straight to my face, claiming the rock formations were geologically unstable and an absolute death trap. As the wind howled around me, the truth hit me with sickening clarity. The inlet was not geologically unstable, It was a heavily guarded perimeter. Nolan had weaponized my trust and my safety to protect his criminal empire. The security boat realized my trajectory. The megaphone blared again, the voice now frantic, warning me that I was heading into a dead zone and would be crushed. They fired a bright flare into the sky, casting a sickly red glow over the raging water, but they immediately cut their engines rapidly, reversing thrust to slow down. They were too large to follow me into the rocks. I was entirely alone as I hit the inlet. The noise was absolute chaos. The skiff was immediately caught in a brutal cross-current, spinning wildly out of control. I gripped the cold metal sides of the boat, bracing for impact, as a massive wave lifted me up and hurled the vessel forward. The sound of tearing metal was horrific. Hidden razor-sharp black rocks sliced through the aluminum hull like a can opener. Freezing salt water rushed over my boots, instantly flooding the bottom of the skiff. The engine sputtered, choked on the water, and died completely, leaving me at the absolute mercy of the ocean. A final towering wall of water caught the back of the sinking boat. It launched the skiff forward with terrifying speed, hurling it directly toward the shoreline. The boat slammed violently into a hidden strip of black sand. The impact was brutal, throwing me entirely out of the wreckage. I hit the wet ground hard, the breath knocked completely out of my lungs. I rolled through the freezing surf, choking on salt water, until I finally dragged my bruised and battered body above the high tide line. I lay there in the wet sand for a long moment, my heart pounding in my ears, clutching my waterproof bag tightly to my chest. I had survived the crash. I slowly pushed myself up onto my knees, my muscles screaming in pain, and looked through the heavy rain at the sheer rock face of the cliff towering above the hidden beach. A sudden brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the darkness. I stopped breathing. There, built seamlessly and directly into the solid natural stone of the island, was a massive, highly advanced biometric steel door. I pushed myself off the wet sand and staggered toward the sheer rock face. Up close, the door was even more intimidating. It was a solid slab of brushed steel, seamlessly integrated into the natural stone of the cliff. There was no handle, no keyhole, nothing but a sleek black glass biometric scanner mounted at eye level. I wiped the freezing rain from my eyes and examined the panel. A red laser briefly scanned my face, and an automated voice calmly requested a retinal verification or a 10-digit alphanumeric master passcode. I had neither. Panic threatened to paralyze me, but I shoved it down. I was a forensic accountant. I spent my entire career breaking into highly secure encrypted corporate networks. A physical door was just a server with hinges. I unzipped my waterproof bag and pulled out my laptop. Miraculously, the heavy casing had survived the boat crash. I grabbed a specialized diagnostic bypass cable I kept in my kit, pried open the small maintenance casing beneath the biometric scanner with my car key, and jammed the cable directly into the raw data port. I sat cross-legged in the freezing mud, balancing the laptop on my knees. I booted up my decryption software and began coding furiously. My fingers were completely numb from the cold, but I forced them to move across the keyboard, initiating a brute force attack on the door's handshake protocol. The progress bar crawled across the screen with agonizing slowness. I needed time, but time was the one thing I absolutely did not have. Over the deafening howl of the nor'easter storm, I heard a new terrifying sound: the deep mechanical roar of boat engines. The security team from the tactical speedboat had not given up. They had navigated around the treacherous inlet and made landfall on a more protected stretch of the island's coastline just a few hundred yards away. I heard the heavy thud of combat boots hitting the wet sand. Then a sound that made my blood run completely cold echoed through the darkness. It was the vicious, guttural barking of trained attack dogs. I kept my eyes glued to my laptop screen, typing frantically to bypass the secondary firewall, when the wind carried the voices of the approaching men. A guard with a booming, authoritative voice yelled out commands to the rest of the squad. He told them to spread out along the tree line and release the hounds. Then he shouted the order that changed everything. He screamed. Jamal said, "Shoot on sight." I repeat, shoot on sight, do not bring her back. Find her and finish it. My breath caught in my throat. The reality of my situation crashed down on me heavier than the ocean waves. Jamal was not just an arrogant investment broker trying to cover up white-collar embezzlement. He was actively running a private, highly organized, and fully lethal operation. This was a paramilitary hit squad. They were not here to intimidate me into signing a piece of real estate over to his firm. They were here to execute me, throw my body into the crushing currents, and ensure the missing $40 million was permanently blamed on a dead woman. I focused all of my absolute terror into my fingertips. The bypass program had successfully breached the outer security layer, but the system suddenly locked up. A prompt flashed on the screen, demanding a localized seed cipher. The software needed a base code to crack the final encryption, something the system administrator would have manually hard-coded into the override. I needed Nolan's master password. I rapidly typed in his birth date. The screen flashed red. Access denied. I typed in his social security number. Access denied. I tried the founding date of his first tech startup, the name of his childhood street, and even his mother Beatrice's birthday. Every single attempt was instantly rejected. The dogs were getting closer. I could hear them tearing through the heavy coastal brush, their barks growing louder and more frenzied as they picked up my scent on the wet beach. I had less than 30 seconds before they rounded the rock formation and saw me sitting in the open. I closed my eyes, trying to think exactly like my arrogant, self-centered husband. Nolan always tied his security to things he felt he controlled, but he also used passwords that amused him, things he secretly despised but had to remember. My mind raced back to our 5 years of marriage. What was the one sequence of numbers he consistently forgot every single year? The date. He never cared about the date I always had to remind him of while I sat alone at a restaurant table paying for our dinner. Our wedding anniversary. I opened my eyes and typed the 6-digit date of our anniversary into the command prompt. My hands were shaking so violently I almost hit the wrong key. I heard the crunch of boots on gravel. The guards emerged onto the edge of the beach. A blinding high-powered flashlight beam swept violently across the dark sand and locked directly onto my back. A guard shouted my name. The dog snarled and lunged forward. I hit the enter key. The laptop screen flashed brilliant green. The heavy steel door behind me emitted a loud mechanical hiss of releasing pneumatic pressure. The heavy deadbolts clicked open and the slab of metal slid back just enough for a person to fit through. I grabbed my bag, threw my body sideways, and dove headfirst into the dark opening just as a gunshot rang out and a bullet sparked against the steel frame, exactly where my head had been a second before. I hit the smooth metallic floor hard, scraping my knees against polished stone. The heavy steel door slid shut behind me with a solid, echoing thud, instantly severing the deafening roar of the storm and the frantic barking of the dogs outside. The heavy deadbolts engaged automatically with a series of loud mechanical clicks, sealing me securely inside. I lay there for a moment, gasping for air, the sound of my own ragged breathing the only noise in the sudden, eerie quiet. I had narrowly escaped being shot by Jamal's hit squad, but the adrenaline was still surging violently through my veins. I fully expected to find myself in a damp, cavernous stone tunnel or a cold, utilitarian military storage facility. But as my eyes adjusted to the sudden brightness, I slowly pushed myself up, brushed the wet sand from my coat, and stared in absolute disbelief. This was no dark cave. It was a pristine, brightly lit, multi-million-dollar luxury bunker. The walls were clad in imported rich mahogany panels, and the floor beneath my ruined, waterlogged boots was made of radiant, heated marble. I slowly stood up, clutching my laptop bag tightly to my chest, my wet clothes dripping a puddle of seawater onto the immaculate stone. Soft, warm, ambient lighting illuminated a sprawling living room that looked like it belonged on the cover of an elite architectural magazine. Massive custom white leather sofas sat perfectly arranged around a modern glass-enclosed fireplace. The flames were artificial, but the heat radiating from the unit was real and deeply comforting against my freezing skin. I walked further into the room, my boots squeaking softly against the polished marble. My eyes traced the walls, and a wave of pure, nauseating betrayal washed over me, replacing my fear with an intense, burning anger. Hanging prominently above the fireplace was a massive, original abstract painting. I recognized the artist immediately. It was a piece I had seen in an exclusive gallery catalog 2 years ago, priced well over $150,000. I turned to my left and saw a climate-controlled glass-enclosed wine cellar, stocked from floor to ceiling with hundreds of rare vintages. I walked up to the thick glass and read the ornate labels. These were the exact bottles Nolan claimed he could never afford. I remembered the countless times I had worked 60-hour weeks stressing over our mortgage payments, our property taxes, and our utility bills. Whenever I asked Nolan to contribute, he would sigh heavily, run his hands through his hair, and play the role of the struggling, misunderstood entrepreneur. He had manipulated me into paying for every single aspect of our domestic life on the mainland, draining my energy, my savings, and my salary, all so he could funnel his illicit millions into outfitting this hidden underground palace. Every piece of designer furniture, every expensive bottle of wine, and every square inch of this pristine marble floor was paid for by the massive fraud he had framed me for. I tightened my grip on the strap of my bag, my sadness completely hardening into a cold, focused resolve. I was not just going to clear my professional name, I was going to burn his entire secret financial empire to the ground. I moved past the opulent living room and stepped softly down a wide, warmly lit corridor. The advanced air filtration system hummed quietly above me, keeping the subterranean environment perfectly controlled and smelling faintly of expensive cedar and citrus. The bunker was massive, clearly extending deep into the solid bedrock of the island. I turned a corner and found myself standing at the edge of a massive state-of-the-art gourmet kitchen. Stainless steel appliances gleamed flawlessly under recessed ceiling lights, and a long island made of pure white quartz dominated the center of the room. I took a cautious step forward, checking my corners, acutely aware of how loud my wet boots sounded. The silence in the bunker felt heavy, almost suffocating. Then I heard a soft, mechanical whirring sound. I looked toward the far counter. A high-end commercial espresso machine was turned on its digital interface, glowing brightly in the dim kitchen. I walked slowly toward the quartz island, my eyes locked on the sleek machine. Resting perfectly on the counter right next to it was a small ceramic mug. I reached out and hovered my trembling hand over the rim. Intense heat radiated against my freezing skin. I stared down at the dark liquid inside. Plumes of fresh steam were still gently curling and rising from the surface of the freshly poured coffee. My heart slammed against my ribs. The bunker was not empty. Someone was here. Someone was. I stared at the wisps of steam curling from the ceramic mug, my mind struggling to process the impossible reality. Someone was not just here in this underground fortress. Someone had been standing in this exact spot mere seconds ago. I heard the faint but distinct sound of heavy footsteps approaching from the adjacent corridor. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my chest. I had no weapon, no backup, and no way out. I dropped to my knees, practically diving behind the massive white quartz kitchen island, dragging my waterproof bag with me. I pressed my back flat against the smooth wooden cabinetry, pulling my knees tight to my chest, and clamped both hands over my mouth to muffle the sound of my erratic breathing. The footsteps grew louder, unhurried and confident. They crossed the threshold into the kitchen. I could hear the rustle of expensive fabric and the solid click of dress shoes against the marble tile. A man was speaking, his voice echoing slightly in the large open space. He sounded intensely irritated. He was talking on a satellite phone, complaining bitterly about the severe nor'easter storm battering the island above us. He paced back and forth just a few feet away from where I was hiding, completely unaware of my presence. He told the person on the other end of the line to calm down, his tone dripping with absolute condescension. He explained that the private pilot said the crosswinds were too dangerous to take off. He insisted that they could not risk the flight to Geneva until the storm broke, dismissing the delay as a minor temporary inconvenience. My heart completely stopped in my chest. The blood roaring in my ears suddenly went quiet. I knew that voice. I knew the arrogant inflection, the slight impatient sigh that always preceded his sentences, and the highly specific way he pronounced his words. It was scientifically, physically impossible. I had just stood in the freezing rain at the cemetery hours ago. I had watched his heavy mahogany casket being lowered into the muddy ground. I had accepted the condolences of our friends. But the voice echoing above me in the kitchen was unmistakable. The man paused, listening to the frantic shouting coming through the small speaker of the satellite phone. I could faintly hear Jamal's voice on the other end, panicked and angry. Then the man in the kitchen laughed. It was a cold, cruel, soulless sound that I had never heard during our entire 5 years of marriage. He told Jamal to stop panicking and stick to the plan. The man stated with absolute certainty that the federal agents were chasing Clara, not them. He gloated about how easily they had fed my digital signature to the authorities on a silver platter. He promised Jamal that by the time the FBI finished tearing apart my accounting firm, seizing my bank accounts, and throwing me in federal prison, they would be drinking vintage champagne in Switzerland. Then he delivered the final crushing blow. He chuckled darkly and told Jamal that the idiot actually thought he was dead. He mocked me, saying I bought the whole fiery car crash routine without asking a single question. I stopped breathing entirely. The pristine kitchen started to spin. Nolan, my husband, the man I had loved, financially supported, and grieved for. He was alive. He was standing less than 10 feet away from me, drinking espresso in a hidden luxury bunker. He had faked his own death. The tragic accident, the closed casket funeral, because his body was supposedly burned beyond recognition, the sudden execution of the will to leave me drowning in debt, it was all a meticulously crafted stage play. He had orchestrated the entire nightmare to frame me for the missing $40 million while he escaped the country with his family. He had let me weep over an empty grave so he could walk away incredibly rich and completely free. A blinding wave of rage and profound shock hit me so hard my muscles involuntarily spasmed. The woman who had cried at the cemetery died in that exact moment, replaced by a cold, calculating survivor. I shifted my weight slightly, trying to reach into my bag for the heavy diagnostic cable or anything I could use as a weapon to defend myself. As I moved, the thick fabric of my wet coat brushed against the edge of the quartz countertop. The heavy material snagged the handle of a silver espresso spoon, resting precariously near the edge of the island. I watched in agonizing slow motion as the spoon tipped over the side. It hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, ringing clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet kitchen. Nolan stopped speaking instantly. The kitchen plunged into a terrifying dead silence. I heard the dull thud of the satellite phone being dropped onto the counter. Then the unmistakable metallic click of a handgun slide being racked back echoed through the room. The metallic click of the handgun slide racking back echoed off the pristine marble walls like a thunderclap. Nolan took a slow, deliberate step toward the kitchen island. I had seconds before he rounded the corner and found me. I needed a distraction. I grabbed my heavy waterproof bag, unzipped the side pocket, and blindly hurled a metal water bottle over the counter toward the glass-enclosed wine cellar. The heavy steel bottle slammed into the glass with a deafening crash. Nolan instantly pivoted and fired a shot blindly toward the noise. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space. In that split second, I scrambled out from the opposite side of the quartz island, staying low to the ground, and bolted through the archway into the dark corridor beyond. I heard Nolan curse violently, his dress shoes slipping slightly on the polished marble as he turned to chase me. He did not know who had infiltrated his fortress yet. I sprinted down the hallway, my wet boots slapping wetly against the floor. I ducked into a lavishly decorated subterranean library, hiding behind a massive floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelf. Nolan walked slowly down the hall, his gun raised, his breathing heavy. He kicked the double doors of the library wide open. The silence that followed was agonizing. Then he let out a low, dark chuckle. He had seen the muddy footprints and the puddle of seawater my clothes had left on the pristine floor. He called out my name, Clara. His voice dripped with a sick mixture of amusement and absolute malice. He said he should have known I would be too stubborn to just take Jamal's $500,000 and walk away. He began stalking through the interconnected rooms of the bunker, his footsteps echoing ominously. "Come out, Clara," he yelled, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings. "You were always so obsessed with the truth. Well, here it is. Well, hear it. You wanted to see what I was building while you were paying the electric bill." He taunted me as he searched the room deliberately, knocking over expensive lamps and sweeping books off the shelves to flush me out. He laughed again, a sound that made my skin crawl and completely shattered any lingering illusion of the man I had married. He told me I was the absolute perfect cover. He said nobody would ever suspect a struggling, failing tech entrepreneur of washing cartel money when he had a squeaky clean, federally licensed forensic auditor wife balancing his books at the kitchen table. He confessed that every late night I spent stressing over our taxes, every dime I poured into our household, was a meticulously calculated distraction. He needed me utterly exhausted and financially drained, so I would never have the energy to look too closely at his offshore shell companies. I was never his equal partner in life. I was his human shield, a blind alibi that kept the IRS and the FBI entirely off his scent for 5 long years. As he moved toward the back of the library, I held my breath, sliding silently along the dark wall and slipping through a secondary maintenance door that led deeper into the complex. I navigated a maze of narrow, dimly lit utility corridors. I was not looking for an exit anymore. I was looking for the mainframe. If I was going to die in this underground tomb, I was going to take his $40 million and his freedom down with me. I turned a final corner and saw it at the end of a heavily reinforced hallway. It was a massive state-of-the-art server room enclosed entirely by thick, transparent ballistic glass. Rows of sleek black server racks hummed loudly, blinking, with thousands of tiny green and blue LED lights. This was the beating heart of his criminal empire, the exact physical location where my forged digital signature had authorized the transfers. I sprinted toward this glass room. Nolan heard my boots hitting the metal grating and shouted my name, his heavy shoes pounding against the floorboards right behind me. I reached the server room door, grabbed the heavy steel lever, and threw myself inside. I slammed the door shut just as Nolan rounded the corner at the end of the hall. I frantically engaged the heavy interior deadbolts and slammed my hand against the electronic locking mechanism. The security panel flashed red, sealing me perfectly inside the soundproof, climate-controlled room. Nolan sprinted up to the glass, his face contorted in absolute psychotic fury. He raised his handgun and fired 3 rapid shots directly at my chest. The bullets flattened instantly against the reinforced ballistic glass, leaving nothing but white, powdery spiderweb fractures in the thick pane. I stood on the other side, completely unharmed, staring him down with pure hatred. Nolan screamed in frustration, his voice muffled by the thick barrier. He holstered his weapon, spun around, and ripped a massive, heavy-duty fire axe from an emergency glass case mounted on the corridor wall. He turned back to me, his eyes wide with lethal rage, raised the axe high above his head, and brought it crashing down against the glass door. The heavy steel head of the fire axe slammed into the ballistic glass with a deafening crack. The entire server room vibrated from the sheer force of the impact, but the reinforced pane held, scattering a new jagged web of white fractures across the smooth surface. Nolan did not stop to admire his work. He pulled the axe back and swung again, putting his entire body weight into the blow. The sound was horrific, a rhythmic, violent pounding that echoed harshly over the steady mechanical hum of the massive server racks. I knew the glass was rated to stop bullets, but it was not designed to withstand a sustained, frenzied attack from a heavy steel melee weapon indefinitely. I had only minutes before the structural integrity failed completely. I dropped to the metal-grated floor, completely ignoring the terrifying thuds behind me, and scrambled toward the primary mainframe console. My clothes were still dripping freezing seawater, and my knees ached fiercely, but adrenaline masked the pain. I unzipped my waterproof bag, pulled out my laptop, and grabbed a direct interface cable. My hands were shaking so violently from the cold and terror that I almost dropped the connector, but I forced myself to focus. I jammed the thick cable directly into the master data port on the console. I flipped my screen open and rapidly initiated a direct physical override. Plugged straight into the hardware, I easily bypassed the external security layers that had blocked my remote access at the motel. But Jamal had installed a military-grade internal firewall to protect the core holding accounts, and it fiercely rejected my entry commands. Nolan swung the heavy axe again, this time hitting directly near the electronic locking mechanism. A sharp splinter of glass shot off the interior of the door and bounced across the floorboards. He was breathing heavily, his face distorted by a sickening mixture of physical exhaustion and pure malice. Realizing he could not break through immediately, he decided to use the one weapon he had always wielded perfectly against me: psychological warfare. He pressed his face close to the fractured glass, his eyes wide and manic in the dim light of the corridor. He screamed over the loud noise of the cooling fans, telling me to open the door and accept the inevitable. He shouted that my entire life with him was a meticulously constructed lie. He yelled that his mother Beatrice never liked me. He laughed as he told me that Rebecca absolutely hated my guts from the very first day I walked into their pristine family estate. He said they all mocked me relentlessly behind my back, laughing at the naive accountant who was desperately trying to buy her way into a wealthy family by paying all the household bills with her pathetic paychecks. His words were carefully designed to break me, to reduce me to the crying, confused widow he had left behind at the cemetery. But the woman he manipulated was dead. I did not look up from my screen. My fingers flew across the keyboard, deploying an aggressive localized decryption worm to eat through the firewall code. I typed relentlessly, ignoring the stinging pain in my frozen fingers and the cruel taunts of the man I once loved. Nolan struck the door again, the heavy thud rattling the frame so hard the hinges groaned. He screamed that I was nothing but a tool for them, a completely disposable asset. He yelled that they needed a clean name, a licensed professional with federal clearance to make their money laundering operation look legitimate. He said I was too blindly in love and too exhausted from working to ever notice my own husband using my digital signature to wash millions in stolen funds. He demanded I open the door right now, promising that if I surrendered, he would convince Jamal to make my death quick and painless. I completely tuned out his voice, focusing entirely on the glowing blue screen. I watched the progress bar on my decryption worm push past 90%. The glass door groaned loudly, the heavy metal brackets starting to buckle under the repeated strikes. Another massive blow landed, and a chunk of the aluminum frame bent inward. Then my laptop screen suddenly flashed bright green. The worm had successfully breached the final security protocol. The command prompt vanished, replaced by a sleek, highly secure financial dashboard. My eyes rapidly scanned the interface. There it was, the stolen $40 million. It was sitting right there in a temporary holding account, fully staged for the final international jump. I looked at the execution timer counting down in the top right corner. The system was scheduled to initiate an irrevocable wire transfer to a numbered Swiss bank account in exactly 10 minutes. I had them. I had the physical proof and the power to end this. All I needed to do was inject my override script, reroute the fortune into a frozen federal account, and trigger the IRS whistleblower protocol. I raised my hands to the keyboard, taking a deep breath, ready to destroy his life forever. But before my fingers could strike the keys, a soft, polite electronic chime echoed clearly through the underground bunker. It was the unmistakable sound of the main elevator arriving from the surface helipad. Nolan stopped swinging the axe. He slowly lowered his weapon and turned his head toward the corridor. The heavy steel doors of the elevator slid open. The heavy steel doors of the main elevator slid open with a soft electronic chime. The polished metal panels parted to reveal Jamal stepping confidently out into the subterranean corridor. He was dressed impeccably in a dark cashmere overcoat, completely dry and entirely unbothered by the violent storm raging on the surface. Right behind him walked my sister-in-law Rebecca, adjusting the collar of her designer trench coat, followed closely by Beatrice, who looked as composed as if she were arriving for a Sunday brunch. Flanking the family were four massive private security contractors, each holding a tactical rifle securely across their chest. They had not risked their lives crashing a small aluminum boat through a deadly rocky inlet. They had utilized the island's hidden storm-reinforced helicopter pad, flying safely above the treacherous waters while I was fighting for my life in the freezing ocean below. Seeing his family arrive, Nolan let out a heavy sigh of relief. He lowered the heavy steel fire axe, letting the head rest against the metal-grated floor. A wide, sickeningly triumphant grin spread across his sweating face. He took a step back, gesturing grandly toward the splintered glass of the server room, like a twisted tour guide showing off a prized exhibit. I stood completely paralyzed inside the soundproof, climate-controlled enclosure. The soft green glow from the financial dashboard on my laptop screen illuminated my terrified face. I was entirely boxed in. There were no air ducts large enough to crawl through, no secondary emergency exits, and absolutely no way to fight my way past four heavily armed mercenaries and my entire treacherous family. Beatrice stepped right up to the heavily fractured ballistic glass. She looked me up and down, taking in my soaked, muddy clothes and my bleeding knees. She slowly, deliberately clapped her hands together, the sharp, insulting sound piercing through the damaged door. She smiled a cold, aristocratic sneer that completely lacked any human empathy. She told me the stray dog had finally found her way to the pound. She mocked my desperate attempt to uncover the truth, calling it a pathetic final act of a woman who never understood her place in the world. Rebecca stepped up beside her mother and let out a sharp, genuine laugh. She crossed her arms and turned to look at her husband. She told Jamal she was right all along. She gloated that she had specifically warned him I would never just take the $500,000 check and sign the island deed over quietly. Rebecca leaned close to the glass, her eyes burning with pure contempt. She said I always had to prove I was the smartest person in the room. She reminded me of the time I insisted on auditing the family trust 3 years ago, a move that forced them to create this entire elaborate underground scheme just to bypass my annoying working-class morality. She told me my obsessive need for the truth was the exact thing that was going to get me killed today. Jamal held up his hand, instantly silencing his wife. The smooth corporate facade he wore at the downtown law office was entirely gone, replaced by the cold, calculating demeanor of a man who routinely destroyed lives for profit. He walked slowly up to the glass door, completely ignoring the massive cracks Nolan had created. He reached inside his cashmere coat and pulled out a single perfectly crisp sheet of typed paper. He pressed the document flat against the glass so I could read it clearly. It was a suicide note. It was meticulously written, detailing a full fake confession to the $40 million embezzlement. The letter claimed that I had used my professional credentials to steal the funds and that I simply could not live with the unbearable guilt following my beloved husband's tragic car accident. It was the perfect bow to tie up their massive federal crime. Jamal leaned in close, his breath fogging the cold glass. He pointed a long, manicured finger at the digital security camera mounted in the upper corner of the server room. His voice was completely devoid of emotion, a flat, businesslike tone that made the threat infinitely more terrifying. He told me to unlock the door immediately. He instructed me to sit at the terminal, read the suicide note word for word directly into the camera, and execute the final wire transfer routing the stolen money to their Swiss accounts. He promised that if I cooperated, he would ensure my death was quick, painless, and clean. Then he tapped his finger sharply against the glass right in front of my face. He warned me that if I refused, they would breach the room and things would get very, very ugly. I looked at Jamal's cold, dead eyes through the fractured glass, then at the four heavily armed mercenaries raising their tactical rifles, their laser sights painting my chest in bright red dots. I knew that if I forced them to breach the door, I would be killed instantly in the crossfire, and the truth would die with me right there on the floor. Slowly, I reached toward the electronic keypad mounted on the wall. My fingers hovered over the release button. I took a deep breath, steeling my nerves, and pressed it. The heavy magnetic locks disengaged with a loud final click, and the thick ballistic glass door swung open. The mercenaries instantly swarmed inside the small server enclosure. Rough-gloved hands grabbed my arms, hauling me violently away from my laptop. They dragged me out into the polished corridor, my wet boots slipping awkwardly on the marble floor. They marched me down the hallway toward the main control center of the bunker. The room was massive, dominated by a semi-circular mahogany desk, equipped with a sleek bank of high-definition monitors. They forced me down into a heavy leather office chair in the exact center of the room. Jamal walked up closely behind me, the soft fabric of his expensive cashmere coat brushing against my shoulder. A second later, I felt the cold, heavy steel barrel of his handgun press firmly against my right temple. I did not tremble. I refused to give them the satisfaction of my terror. I looked past the glowing monitors, locking eyes with my husband. Nolan was leaning casually against the doorframe, still holding his fire axe, looking incredibly pleased with himself. I looked at Rebecca, who was smirking from a plush sofa in the corner, and Beatrice, who was watching me with the absolute satisfaction of a queen who had just successfully crushed a peasant rebellion. I spoke, my voice remarkably steady and clear despite the loaded weapon pressed against my head. I looked at them all and asked how they could possibly justify this level of absolute evil. I stared directly at Nolan and asked how he could orchestrate a horrific, fiery car crash, watch me grieve hysterically at his empty grave, and frame his own devoted wife for federal embezzlement. I asked if dragging his mother and his sister into a massive lethal conspiracy was really worth $40 million. Jamal leaned down, pressing the barrel of the gun harder against my skin until it bruised. He sneered, his breath hot against my ear. He told me it was not just about the money. He said it was for legacy, Clara. Something a working-class girl like you knows absolutely nothing about. He explained that his investment firm was the crown jewel of their family's wealth, an empire built over generations. When his aggressive investments started hemorrhaging capital, the entire family name was at risk of complete public ruin and federal investigation. Jamal's voice dripped with pure venomous arrogance. He said they could not let an outsider like me sit safely in my comfortable suburban house while their legacy collapsed into bankruptcy. They needed a scapegoat. They needed someone who looked perfect on paper, and my pristine federal forensic accounting license made me the absolute perfect target. I was the ideal sponge to absorb their financial sins and fund their luxurious escape to Europe. Nolan walked over to the desk and placed a small high-definition digital camera on a tripod directly in front of the monitors. A red recording light blinked to life, capturing my exhausted, battered face, and the gun pointed at my head. Jamal reached over my shoulder and slapped the typed suicide note onto the desk right in front of the keyboard. He told me the rules were incredibly simple. He instructed me to log into the master terminal, initiate the final transfer of the $40 million to their offshore accounts in Geneva, and then read the suicide note verbatim into the camera. He promised that if I followed his script perfectly, once the money cleared the international servers, the bullet would be fast, and I would not feel a thing. I looked down at the fabricated suicide note detailing my fake guilt, my supposed greed, and my desperate apology for ruining my wonderful husband's life. The sheer audacity of their plan was staggering. Then I looked up, staring dead center into the blinking red lens of the digital camera. The intense, suffocating fear that had gripped me since I stood at the cemetery completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating, and razor-sharp clarity. I raised my hands and gently placed my fingers on the mechanical keyboard. I did not cry. I did not beg for my life. Instead, a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I tilted my head slightly, ignoring the gun against my temple, and spoke clearly into the microphone. "You are right, Jamal," I said, my voice echoing with absolute authority in the quiet control room. "I am a numbers girl, and you all failed basic accounting." Jamal pressed the gun harder against my temple, his finger tightening slightly on the trigger. He demanded to know what I was talking about, ordering me to shut my mouth and execute the offshore transfer immediately. I did not flinch. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with a speed and precision born from years of high-pressure federal auditing. Jamal leaned heavily over my shoulder, his dark eyes frantically scanning the complex lines of code scrolling rapidly across the high-definition monitor. He fully expected to see the standard international banking interface, the familiar routing numbers for his hidden Swiss accounts. But I was not logging into his offshore banking portal. I was accessing the root directory of his entire criminal mainframe. He shouted at me to stop playing games, warning me that his patience was entirely gone. I calmly opened a secondary window. It looked exactly like his secure financial portal, completely fooling his arrogant eyes. It was merely a mirrored dummy interface I had coded back in that dingy, freezing motel room. It masked the true operation happening in the background, buying me the precious seconds I needed. The hidden progress bar at the bottom of the screen began to fill rapidly, extracting every single byte of data from their isolated network. As the extraction script ran, I looked directly into the blinking red lens of the digital camera that was supposed to record my fabricated suicide. I addressed Jamal loudly and clearly, making absolutely sure the microphone captured every single syllable. I asked him if he had ever bothered to read up on the IRS whistleblower program during his lucrative career as a corrupt investment broker. Jamal froze. The gun against my head wavered for a fraction of a second. I did not stop typing. I explained that when a federally licensed forensic accountant provides the government with irrefutable physical evidence of a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud, the authorities do not just offer them a pat on the back and legal immunity, they pay them a massive financial bounty for their services. I told him the standard federal payout is 30% of the total recovered funds. From the corner of the room, Rebecca scoffed loudly. She stood up from the plush sofa, her face contorted with annoyance, and told Jamal to just shoot me and execute the transfer himself. Beatrice agreed, smoothing her expensive dress and complaining that my incessant talking was giving her a headache. But Jamal was completely paralyzed. His extensive knowledge of corporate law finally caught up with his arrogance. He stared at the screen, finally realizing the dummy interface was a trap, but he did not know how to stop the complex script I had already initiated. I kept typing, breaking down the exact math for my stunned, treacherous family. I told them that 30% of $40 million was exactly $12 million. I looked at Nolan, who was still standing by the doorframe. I told my husband that he and his family had spent 5 years treating me like an unpaid servant, a naive working-class fool who would just silently balance their books, pay their mortgage, and fund their lavish lifestyle while they stole millions behind my back. But instead of destroying me, they had perfectly orchestrated my early retirement. I smiled and told them they had just set up a $12 million payday for me, entirely tax-free and completely legal. Nolan finally realized the absolute catastrophe unfolding right in front of him. The smug, triumphant expression melted off his face, replaced by pure terror. He dropped the heavy fire axe onto the marble floor with a loud crash and sprinted toward the command desk. He screamed at Jamal to shoot me, to rip the power cords out of the wall, to pull the plug on the terminal, to do absolutely anything to stop the system. The 4 mercenaries raised their rifles, shouting confused orders at each other as the chaotic energy in the room spiked to a lethal level. But they were too late. The hidden progress bar hit 100%. My thumb slammed down hard on the enter key. The entire bank of monitors flashed a blinding, brilliant green. A massive, undeniable confirmation notification appeared in bold white letters across every single screen in the control room. A highly encrypted, uncontainable data packet had just successfully bypassed their localized firewall and launched out of the bunker's secure satellite uplink. Simultaneously, the $40 million vanished entirely from their holding account, instantly rerouted and locked permanently into a frozen federal treasury account. Jamal lost his mind. He grabbed me violently by the shoulders, ripping me out of the heavy leather office chair and throwing me hard onto the marble floor. He dropped to his knees, pressing the barrel of the gun directly between my eyes. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, his face purple with rage, demanding to know what I had just done. I looked up at him from the cold floor, completely unafraid of the weapon in his hand. I looked him dead in the eye and replied that I had just sent his entire server history, all of his encrypted financial ledgers, and the high-definition security footage of my dead husband walking around this bunker, directly to the director of the FBI. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute, broken only by the heavy mechanical hum of the server racks. Jamal stared at me, the barrel of his handgun shaking violently against my forehead. The terrifying reality of federal prison began to sink into his cold eyes. Nolan, however, completely snapped. He let out a feral, desperate scream, realizing that the video file I had just sent proved to the world he was not a charred corpse buried in a mainland graveyard. He lunged across the control room, his hands outstretched like claws, aiming to wrap his fingers directly around my throat and silence me forever. But before Nolan could even reach me, Jamal stood up, pivoted sharply on his heel, and delivered a devastating punch squarely to Nolan's jaw. Nolan crashed hard into the mahogany desk, knocking two high-definition monitors to the marble floor in a shower of sparks and shattered glass. Jamal stood over him, his chest heaving, the gun now pointing wildly between my bleeding husband and the floor. Jamal screamed at Nolan, his voice cracking with pure panic and unfiltered rage. He blamed Nolan for everything, shouting that his incredibly sloppy security protocols and his arrogant insistence on keeping this island operational had ruined their entire empire. Jamal yelled that Nolan was supposed to ensure I was completely locked out of the accounts, but instead he had practically handed me the keys to the federal vault. The absolute facade of their perfect, wealthy family evaporated in a matter of seconds. Rebecca, who had spent the last hour smirking at me from the plush corner sofa, suddenly burst into hysterical, hyperventilating tears. She did not run over to help her bleeding brother on the floor. Instead, she turned her manic energy entirely onto her mother. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Beatrice, screaming at the top of her lungs. Rebecca yelled that this was all Beatrice's fault. She cried out that Beatrice had constantly assured them I was just a stupid, gullible, working-class accountant who would never figure out the scheme. She blamed her mother for pushing them to use my digital credentials in the first place, claiming Beatrice's obsessive greed and need to control the family wealth had just condemned them all to federal prison. Rebecca wailed about her social standing, screaming that her friends at the country club would watch her get dragged away in handcuffs on national television. Beatrice's aristocratic composure shattered completely. Her face turned crimson with rage. Without a single word of hesitation, Beatrice stepped forward and slapped her own daughter violently across the face. The sharp crack echoed over the chaos of the room. Beatrice hissed like a cornered snake, demanding that Rebecca shut her mouth immediately. She told her spoiled daughter that she had spent her entire adult life cleaning up the endless messes of her incompetent, entitled children, and she would not tolerate being blamed now. The golden child and the matriarch were suddenly at each other's throats, their supposed unbreakable family loyalty completely evaporating the second their stolen money was threatened. I pushed myself up from the cold marble floor, backing away slowly as I watched my tormentors tear each other apart. The four heavily armed mercenaries simply lowered their tactical rifles, looking back and forth at the screaming, violent family. They were private contractors paid exclusively from the offshore accounts Jamal maintained. With the FBI undoubtedly mobilizing, and the entire financial operation compromised, their loyalty was already fading fast. One of the guards actually took a deliberate step back toward the open elevator doors, clearly calculating how quickly he could get off the island before the federal choppers arrived. Nolan spat blood onto the polished floor and tried to defend himself, shouting that Jamal was the one who insisted on pushing the $40 million wire transfer through tonight instead of waiting. Jamal kicked Nolan hard in the ribs, screaming that the plan was absolutely flawless, until Nolan failed to secure the biometric door on the beach. It was a pathetic, vicious display of cowards turning on one another. The grand historical legacy they had boasted about just minutes ago meant absolutely nothing. They were just common criminals ready to sell each other out the moment the lights came on. Right in the middle of their vicious screaming match, a sharp, piercing electronic ring cut through the control room. It was the secure satellite phone resting on the edge of the damaged mahogany desk. The fighting stopped instantly. Everyone froze in place, staring at the small black device, as if it were a live explosive. Jamal slowly reached out with a trembling hand and picked it up. He hit the green accept button and put the call on speaker, his breathing heavy and erratic. The crisp, highly accented voice of his Swiss banker filled the quiet room. The man sounded deeply apologetic, but incredibly tense. He said, "Sir, I am calling with an urgent security update regarding your pending transactions. The $40 million transfer was intercepted mid-routing. The funds never reached our secure servers. They have been permanently seized by the United States Treasury Department." The satellite phone slipped from Jamal's trembling fingers. It hit the polished marble floor, the impact shattering the plastic casing and instantly cutting off the Swiss banker's apologies. The control room plunged back into a suffocating, heavy silence. The $40 million was gone. The grand escape to Geneva was gone. The pristine corporate legacy Jamal had ruthlessly protected was now nothing more than a massive federal crime scene. I watched as the reality of his situation crashed over him. His tailored cashmere coat and expensive suit suddenly looked like a ridiculous costume. He was no longer a powerful Manhattan investment broker. He was a ruined man facing the rest of his life inside a maximum security prison cell. Jamal slowly turned his head to look at me. The arrogant, calculating gleam in his dark eyes had completely vanished, replaced by a raw, unhinged bloodlust. He did not care about the money anymore. He did not care about his family or his escape plan. All that was left in him was pure venomous spite. His hand tightened around the grip of his handgun. He raised the weapon, leveling the barrel directly at my chest. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving as he stepped over Nolan's bleeding body on the floor to close the distance between us. He screamed at the top of his lungs, the sound tearing through his throat. He yelled that I had completely ruined his life. He blamed me for destroying his firm, his reputation, and his future. He shouted that I was nothing but a worthless parasite who had infected his family and brought their entire empire crashing to the ground. I did not back away. I did not cower or beg for mercy. I stood my ground, staring straight down the barrel of his gun with absolute defiance. I told him he was wrong. I kept my voice perfectly calm and steady, letting the truth cut through his hysterical screaming. I said, "No, Jamal, you ruined yours when you thought you could outsmart the woman who fixed your tax returns for 5 years." I took a small step forward, refusing to be his victim for 1 second longer. I told him he was incredibly arrogant to think he could hide a massive money laundering operation from the exact person who had balanced his books, managed his personal estate, and covered up his careless financial mistakes year after year. I knew every single fake charity, every shell company, and every offshore dummy account he had ever opened. He had handed me the absolute blueprint to his entire financial life, and then he was stupid enough to make me his enemy. Seeing Jamal completely lose his mind, the 4 heavily armed mercenaries made their final decision. They were paid to protect a billionaire, not to go down for the murder of a federal whistleblower. The lead guard lowered his tactical rifle, completely signaled to his team, and began backing away toward the open elevator doors. Jamal briefly turned his weapon toward them, screaming orders and threatening to kill them if they abandoned their post. The lead guard simply shook his head, hit the elevator button, and told Jamal he was on his own. The doors slid shut, leaving the Golden family entirely trapped with their failures. Nolan scrambled backward on the marble floor, spitting blood, his eyes wide with panic. He grabbed the hem of Jamal's coat, begging him to put the gun down. Nolan cried out that the feds already had the server data, and killing me would only guarantee them all the death penalty. Beatrice screamed from the corner, clutching her chest, while Rebecca huddled on the sofa with her hands over her ears. They were a pathetic, broken mess. Jamal kicked Nolan away with brutal force. He turned back to me, his jaw clenched, his eyes completely hollow. He raised the gun and aimed it directly at my forehead. The heavy metallic click of the hammer pulling back echoed sharply in the quiet room. He told me that even if he was going to prison, he was going to make sure I never lived to spend a single dime of my whistleblower bounty. I braced myself, staring into his eyes, refusing to look away. Just as Jamal's finger tightened on the trigger, the entire subterranean bunker violently shook. A massive, deafening roar of heavy explosives detonating echoed from the upper levels, sending a terrifying shockwave down the corridor. The ceiling above us cracked, raining white dust and debris onto the marble floor. A second later, a horrific crash rang out from the main hallway. The heavy biometric steel door leading into the bunker was blown clean off its hinges, slamming into the stone walls with the force of a freight train. The massive steel door crashed against the far wall of the corridor with a deafening metallic screech, sending a thick cloud of white concrete dust and pulverized rock billowing into the control room. The sheer force of the explosive breach knocked Jamal completely off balance. The handgun slipped from his fingers and clattered uselessly across the polished marble floor. For a single frozen second, the Golden family just stared at the open doorway in absolute paralyzed shock. Then the smoke parted and hell rained down on them. Dozens of heavily armored FBI SWAT agents flooded into the subterranean bunker. They moved with terrifying synchronized precision, their heavy combat boots pounding against the floorboards. Blinding white tactical flashlights and a dozen intersecting red laser sights cut through the swirling dust, instantly painting Jamal, Nolan, Rebecca, and Beatrice. The deafening, authoritative shouts of federal agents commanding everyone to get on the ground echoed off the mahogany walls. Jamal did not even have a chance to raise his hands. Two massive tactical agents hit him simultaneously, tackling the arrogant investment broker violently to the floor. His custom cashmere overcoat bunched up around his neck as an agent planted a heavy knee firmly between his shoulder blades. Jamal let out a sharp gasp of pain as his arms were wrenched behind his back, and thick plastic zip ties were violently cinched around his wrists. The man who had threatened to put a bullet in my head just moments ago was now completely immobilized, his face pressed painfully against the cold stone. Nolan tried to crawl backward toward the plush corner sofa, spitting blood and holding his hands up in a pathetic display of surrender. An agent kicked Nolan's legs out from under him, sending my treacherous husband crashing face first onto the marble. Nolan began to sob, a loud, ugly, whimpering sound that completely shattered any lingering illusion of the confident mastermind he pretended to be. He begged the agents not to hurt him, screaming that he was unarmed and cooperating. Rebecca completely lost her mind. She shrieked hysterically as an agent grabbed her by the arm, trying to pull away and swatting blindly at the tactical gear. She cried out that she was a victim, that her husband had forced her to come here, and that she had absolutely nothing to do with the money. The agents ignored her desperate lies. They forced her down onto her knees, securing her wrists tightly behind her back while she wailed about her ruined designer clothes and her country club reputation. But it was Beatrice who truly could not comprehend the reality of her downfall. As an agent approached her, the proud matriarch actually stood up straighter indignantly, adjusting her expensive pearl necklace. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at the heavily armed SWAT team and ordered them to stop immediately. She demanded to speak to whoever was in charge, shouting that they had absolutely no right to treat her family this way. She screamed that they were wealthy, respected citizens, and she would have every single one of their badges by morning. The agent did not say a word. He grabbed Beatrice by the shoulders, spun her around, and forced the matriarch of the family face down onto the floor right next to her sobbing daughter. Beatrice gasped in absolute outrage as the cold marble pressed against her cheek, her perfect facade entirely destroyed. Through the chaos, the smoke began to clear. A tall, sharply dressed man wearing a navy blue windbreaker with the bold yellow letters FBI emblazoned across the back walked calmly into the control room. He did not yell. He moved with a quiet, absolute authority, stepping over the shattered glass and the discarded fire axe. He was the lead federal agent, the man whose jurisdiction Jamal and Nolan had foolishly thought they could outsmart. The lead agent walked slowly over to where Nolan was pinned against the floor. He looked down at my husband with an expression of profound disgust. He pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt and tossed them to the SWAT officer holding Nolan down. The agent spoke clearly, his voice carrying perfectly over the sound of Rebecca's hysterical crying. "Nolan Vance," the agent said, "you are under arrest for faking your death wire fraud and conspiracy to commit money laundering." Beatrice wailed from the floor, her voice cracking with desperation. She begged the agent to listen, screaming her last name over and over, demanding that he recognize who she was and the legacy her family held. The lead agent barely glanced at her. He coldly informed Beatrice that her family legacy was now officially classified as a federal crime syndicate, and she had the right to remain silent. Then the lead agent turned away from the pathetic broken family on the floor. He walked directly over to where I was standing by the master terminal. His severe expression softened instantly. He reached down and smoothly holstered his weapon. He looked at me with genuine, undeniable respect. "Ms. Clara," the agent said, his voice steady and polite, "your encrypted data packet was received loud and clear at headquarters. The director sends his personal regards." He paused, gesturing toward Jamal and Nolan writhing on the ground. "We have them dead to rights on the financial crimes. But considering what they just put you through tonight, would you like to press additional domestic terrorism charges against them?" I looked at the lead federal agent, considering his offer to press domestic terrorism charges. I told him that while the idea was incredibly tempting, I was perfectly satisfied with letting them rot in federal prison for attempted murder, massive wire fraud, and grand conspiracy. The agent nodded, a slight approving smile touching his professional demeanor, and signaled for his tactical team to begin the formal extraction. The SWAT agents grabbed Jamal, Nolan, Rebecca, and Beatrice by their arms, hauling them roughly up from the cold marble floor. The white concrete dust from the explosive breach was finally beginning to settle, revealing the absolute wreckage of their pristine underground fortress. I took a deep breath and walked slowly across the control room. My dark clothes were completely ruined, soaked with freezing seawater and stained with mud. My knees ached, and I was shivering from the cold, but as I walked past the shattered glass and the broken monitors, I had never felt taller or more powerful in my entire life. The agents forced my in-laws to their knees in a straight line, securing their zip ties and conducting rapid pat-downs. I stopped right in front of Rebecca. Her expensive designer trench coat was covered in thick gray dust, and her perfect makeup was completely destroyed by her hysterical, hyperventilating tears. When she looked up and saw me standing over her, the intense, arrogant entitlement that usually masked her face completely vanished. She leaned forward against her plastic restraints and begged me for mercy. She cried out my name, her voice cracking with sheer desperation, and pleaded with me to tell the federal agents this was all a terrible misunderstanding. "Clara, please," she sobbed, looking frantically around the room. "We are family. You cannot let them do this to us." I crouched down slowly so I was exactly at her eye level. I looked past her tears straight into the shallow, selfish depths of her soul. I asked her if she remembered Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago. I reminded her how I had spent 2 entire days cooking a massive feast for her extended family, paying for all the groceries out of my own pocket because Nolan claimed his business accounts were frozen. I reminded her how she had stood up in the formal dining room, tapped her crystal wine glass, and announced that the main table was reserved for true bloodlines only. She had looked me up and down with sheer disgust and told me to go find another table in the kitchen with the hired help. And the worst part was, her mother Beatrice had smiled, and my husband Nolan had looked away, saying absolutely nothing to defend me. I kept my voice incredibly calm, but every word I spoke was a razor. I told her that she did not consider me family when I was paying her brother's debts, and she certainly did not consider me family when she was plotting to murder me for $40 million on a remote island. "Family," I repeated, shaking my head in disgust. "You told me to find another table at Thanksgiving. Today you do not even get a chair." Rebecca completely collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably against the floor. Beatrice squeezed her eyes shut, turning her face away from me in absolute humiliation. She could not bear to look at the working-class girl who had just single-handedly dismantled her aristocratic legacy. Then I stepped over to Nolan. My husband looked up at me, his jaw already swelling and turning purple from where Jamal had punched him. He opened his mouth desperately, trying to formulate an apology, trying to use the charming boyish voice that had tricked me into loving him 5 years ago. He whispered that he was so sorry that things just got entirely out of hand and that he had always loved me. I felt absolutely nothing for him. The love I had for this man was buried in that empty grave on the mainland. I told him he was a pathetic coward. I told him the worst part of his grand scheme was not that he faked his death or stole millions of dollars. The worst part was that he was too weak to do it without hiding behind my accounting license. I told him to enjoy his 20 years in federal prison because out there, he would have no devoted wife to balance his books or clean up his messes. Jamal just glared at me from the end of the line, his jaw clamped shut in silent, burning fury. He knew it was completely over. I stood back up and nodded to the SWAT commander. The agents yanked my treacherous family to their feet. They dragged them kicking and screaming out of the shattered control room, marching them down the corridor toward the heavy freight elevator that would take them up to the federal helicopters waiting in the storm. The sound of their wailing faded into the distance, leaving me standing in the quiet, ruined bunker. The lead FBI agent walked up beside me as the last of his team secured the perimeter. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a rugged, secure federal tablet. He handed it to me, the screen glowing brightly with the official seal of the United States Treasury Department. He told me the criminal assets were successfully frozen, but there was one final step required by the government. We need you to authorize the final routing of the recovered funds. Miss Clara, he said respectfully, to finalize your bounty. I took the rugged, heavy tablet from the lead federal agent. The screen glowed with the imposing gold and blue seal of the United States Treasury Department. It was a highly restricted interface, the kind of digital portal I had only ever read about in top-tier forensic accounting journals. The agent gestured toward the damaged mahogany desk, inviting me to take a seat at the master terminal one last time. I walked over, stepping carefully around the shattered glass of the broken monitors and the discarded fire axe Nolan had used to try and murder me. I pulled the heavy leather office chair back and sat down. 2 heavily armed SWAT agents stood quietly by the door, completely respectful of my space, acting as my personal security detail while I finalized the operation. I connected the federal tablet to the surviving mainframe console using my encrypted bypass cable. The system immediately recognized the secure handshake. A secondary prompt appeared on the massive screen in front of me, requiring my professional digital signature to officially release the $40 million from the temporary holding lockbox into the permanent federal treasury accounts. Before I typed in my credentials, I paused. I rested my hands on the keyboard and looked at the blinking cursor. The silence of the ruined bunker gave me a moment to truly process exactly what I was about to do. I looked up at the lead agent standing beside the desk and told him about the last 5 years of my life. I told him how my husband had methodically and deliberately broken down my sanity. I explained that whenever I found a glaring discrepancy in our household budget or noticed a missing transfer in his startup accounts, Nolan would look at me with deep fake concern. He would hold my hands, look me in the eye, and tell me I was simply overworking myself. He would say my mind was playing tricks on me, calling me paranoid and crazy, completely gaslighting me into believing I was losing my grip on reality. I told the agent about Beatrice. I recounted how the wealthy matriarch would invite me to her lavish mainland estate, only to treat me like an unpaid maid. She would hand me her empty crystal wine glasses during holiday parties and tell me to make myself useful in the kitchen, casually reminding everyone that I came from nothing and possessed absolutely no class. I spoke about Jamal, who had constantly belittled my accounting career, calling me a low-level number cruncher, while he secretly relied on my pristine federal license to wash his stolen millions. They had spent years stripping away my confidence, my dignity, and my financial independence, all while building a massive criminal empire right under my nose. They called it their legacy. They believed they were untouchable aristocrats destined to rule from their secret island fortress, while I paid the price for their sins. But their entire legacy, their arrogance, and their perfectly crafted illusion of superiority all came down to this single moment. It all came down to the very skills they had so thoroughly underestimated. I looked back at the glowing monitor. I did not feel an ounce of pity or hesitation. I typed my master forensic credentials into the federal portal. I hit the final execute command, permanently locking their stolen $40 million into the United States government grid. With that single keystroke, I erased them. I erased Jamal's corrupt investment firm, I erased Beatrice's high society standing, and I completely obliterated Nolan's secret fortune. The system processed the command instantly. The screen flashed a brilliant solid green indicating the funds were successfully secured by the Department of Justice. The lead agent smiled, leaned over, and tapped a secondary application on the tablet. He told me the government always honors its debts to those who protect the financial integrity of the nation. A new window popped up on the monitor. It was the official IRS whistleblower program confirmation page. The system automatically calculated the mandatory federal reward for my physical evidence and my direct role in recovering the stolen assets. 30% of $40 million. The system prompted me to enter a secure routing number. I typed in the credentials for the brand new highly encrypted private account I had opened just hours ago at a completely different bank. The loading circle spun for a few agonizing seconds. Then a crisp digital receipt appeared on the screen. A clean, completely legal, and entirely tax-free deposit of exactly $12 million had just landed directly into my private account. Exactly 2 weeks later, I sat in the polished wooden gallery of a federal courthouse in downtown Manhattan. The air conditioning was humming quietly, a stark contrast to the deafening roar of the storm on Blackwood Island. I was dressed in a sharp, perfectly tailored charcoal suit, my posture straight, and my expression completely unreadable. The room was packed to the brim with reporters, legal clerks, and former clients of Jamal's ruined investment firm. The trial had moved with unprecedented, blistering speed. In the federal justice system, cases involving $40 million of laundered money usually drag on for years, bogged down by endless motions and high-priced defense attorneys. But not this time. The physical evidence I had extracted directly from their localized server was absolutely insurmountable. I had handed the Department of Justice a perfectly wrapped gift containing the unencrypted financial ledgers, the offshore routing codes, and high-definition security footage of Nolan walking around his underground luxury bunker. The prosecution did not even need to build a circumstantial narrative. The data spoke for itself. Faced with mountains of irrefutable proof and the threat of consecutive life sentences, the Golden family's expensive legal team had immediately folded. They advised their clients to take a swift plea deal, waiving their right to a drawn-out public trial. The heavy wooden doors at the side of the courtroom opened, and the bailiffs led the defendants in. A collective murmur rippled through the gallery. It was jarring to see them. There were no bespoke cashmere overcoats, no designer trench coats, and no imported pearl necklaces. Jamal, Nolan, Rebecca, and Beatrice shuffled into the courtroom wearing bright, standard-issue orange jumpsuits. Their wrists and ankles were bound by heavy steel chains that clinked loudly against the polished floor. They looked hollow-aged and entirely stripped of the arrogant aristocratic legacy they had tried to murder me to protect. Nolan kept his eyes glued to the floor, his shoulders slumped in total defeat. Jamal stared straight ahead, his jaw locked, completely ignoring the reporters snapping photos of his public downfall. The federal judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for white-collar criminals, banged her gavel to silence the room. She looked down at the family from her high bench, her expression one of profound disgust. She did not mince words. She told them that in her 30 years on the bench, she had rarely seen a conspiracy so deeply rooted in sheer, unadulterated entitlement. She leaned forward, locking eyes with each of them. You believed your wealth and your family name placed you entirely above the law, the judge said, her voice echoing sharply across the courtroom. You orchestrated a repulsive scheme to defraud the government, but far worse than that, you used a brilliant, innocent woman as a shield for your greed. You turned a devoted wife into a scapegoat and attempted to execute her when she uncovered your lies. That level of calculated malice will not go unpunished in my courtroom. The judge picked up her sentencing sheet. The silence in the room was absolute. She sentenced Nolan to 20 years in federal prison for faking his death and orchestrating the primary wire fraud. Nolan flinched, a fresh wave of tears spilling down his pale face. She turned to Jamal, citing his role as the master architect of the money laundering ring, and sentenced him to 25 years in a maximum security facility. Jamal just closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling heavily. Finally, the judge addressed Rebecca and Beatrice. For their active, willing participation in the cover-up and their conspiracy to commit murder, she sentenced the Golden Daughter and the proud matriarch to 10 years each in a federal penitentiary. Rebecca immediately collapsed against the defense table, sobbing so hysterically that a bailiff had to physically hold her up by her chained arms. Beatrice stood perfectly rigid. She did not cry. She simply stared at the judge in sheer disbelief, her mind completely unable to process that she was actually going to spend the next decade of her life behind bars. The judge banged her gavel one final time, officially closing the hearing. The bailiff stepped forward, grabbing the defendants by their arms to lead them out through the side doors to the transport buses waiting in the basement. As they were being dragged away, Beatrice suddenly stopped fighting the guards. She turned her head and looked directly across the courtroom, locking eyes with me in the gallery. I did not break eye contact. I calmly reached into my leather handbag and pulled out a glossy full-color real estate brochure. I held it up just high enough for her to see the bold print on the cover. Beatrice's eyes widened in absolute paralyzing horror. She suddenly realized that to pay the massive federal restitution fines, the state had seized all her assets, and her precious mainland estate was being auctioned off to the highest bidder that very afternoon. The heavy oak doors of the state auction house swung shut behind me completely, muting the chaotic noise of the downtown traffic. The grand auditorium was a sharp contrast to the cold, sterile federal courtroom I had just left. This room was steeped in old money, lined with rich mahogany paneling and filled with rows of plush velvet seats. Wealthy real estate developers and corporate investors murmured quietly among themselves, clutching their numbered bidding paddles. I walked slowly down the side aisle and took a standing position at the very back of the room, completely unnoticed in my tailored charcoal suit. I crossed my arms and stared up at the massive digital projector screen dominating the front stage. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man in a sharp tuxedo, stepped up to the podium and adjusted his microphone. He cleared his throat and announced the premier lot of the afternoon. It was a massive forced liquidation of seized federal assets. A high-definition photograph flashed onto the giant screen, drawing collective gasps of admiration from the wealthy crowd. It was Beatrice's beloved mainland estate. The sprawling historical mansion sat on 10 acres of impeccably manicured lawns, surrounded by towering centuries-old oak trees and guarded by heavy wrought iron gates bearing the family crest. It was the absolute crown jewel of their arrogant legacy, the physical manifestation of the wealth they had tried to murder me to protect. The projector cycled through the interior photos of the property. When a picture of the grand entryway flashed onto the screen, my chest tightened. It was a massive, breathtaking foyer featuring imported Italian marble floors, a glittering crystal chandelier, and a sweeping double staircase. Staring at that photograph, a vivid, painful memory washed over me. It was Christmas Eve, 3 years ago. I had just driven through a blinding snowstorm after working a grueling 14-hour audit to cover the massive shortfall in Nolan's latest failed business venture. I was exhausted, freezing, and wearing a sensible damp wool coat. When I walked up the grand stone steps and reached for the heavy brass handle of the front door, Beatrice physically blocked my path. She stood in that exact marble foyer wearing a custom silk gown and holding a crystal champagne flute. She looked me up and down with an expression of absolute disgust. She told me to use the side entrance through the kitchen with the catering staff. She explicitly said I would never have the pedigree, the bloodline, or the sheer class required to step foot in her grand foyer. She told me I reeked of middle-class desperation and that my presence ruined the aesthetic of her perfect family gathering. I had swallowed my pride that night, quietly walking around the house in the freezing snow to enter through the kitchen, too tired to fight back. But today, standing in the back of the auction house, I did not feel small or humiliated. I felt incredibly powerful. The auctioneer banged his wooden gavel against the sounding block, calling the room to order. He announced that because this was a federal seizure meant to rapidly pay down criminal restitution, the starting bid would be severely depressed. He opened the floor at a mere $2 million, an absolute fraction of what the historical property was truly worth. Immediately, paddles shot up across the auditorium. The wealthy developers recognized a massive bargain when they saw one. The fast-paced rhythmic chant of the auctioneer echoed through the room as the price steadily climbed. 2.5 million, 3 million, 3.2 million. I stayed perfectly still in the shadows at the back of the room, watching the men in their expensive suits fight over the scraps of my ruined in-laws. I felt the comforting weight of my leather handbag against my side. Inside that bag was a certified letter from the private bank I had opened 2 weeks ago. My account held a pristine, perfectly legal, and entirely tax-free deposit of $12 million. The IRS whistleblower bounty. I was not just here to buy a piece of real estate. I was here to purchase the ultimate symbol of their arrogance, using the exact money they had tried to steal. The bidding war began to slow down as the price hit $3.8 million. The local developers started lowering their paddles, hesitant to push their margins any higher on a distressed asset. The auctioneer scanned the crowd, his voice dropping an octave as he called out for $4 million. He looked left, then right. He raised his gavel, preparing to close the lot. Going once, he announced. Going twice. I stepped out from the shadows into the soft glow of the aisle lights. I raised my numbered paddle high into the air. I did not wait for him to ask for incremental bids. I spoke with a crisp, clear authority that sliced through the quiet tension of the auditorium, ensuring every single person in the room heard me. 5 million, I said. A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Dozens of heads turned to look at the woman in the back, who had just casually dropped a massive, undeniable overbid. The auctioneer blinked in surprise, momentarily losing his rapid-fire rhythm. He quickly recovered, scanning the room for any challengers, asking if anyone dared to counter the $5 million bid. The room was dead silent. No one raised a paddle. The auctioneer smiled and brought his heavy wooden gavel down hard against the block. The loud, sharp crack echoed with absolute finality. "Sold," he shouted, pointing directly at me. I lowered my paddle, a slow, deeply satisfied smile spreading across my face. Beatrice was currently sitting in a cold concrete holding cell in a bright orange jumpsuit, completely stripped of her wealth and her freedom. And I had just bought her entire untouchable family legacy for pennies on the dollar. I stood on the sprawling master balcony of the mainland estate, the crisp coastal breeze gently blowing my hair. In my right hand, I held a delicate crystal glass filled with a rare vintage red wine. It was a specific bottle I had legally acquired from the federal liquidation of my dead husband's hidden underground cellar. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip, letting the rich flavor wash over me as I looked out over the 10 acres of perfectly manicured lawns that I now owned completely free and clear. But the serene beauty of the grounds was sharply contrasted by the absolute chaotic noise echoing from inside the house behind me. I turned around and leaned against the heavy stone balustrade, watching the demolition crew work. I had hired a premium team of private contractors, paying them triple their usual rate to work double shifts. A massive industrial dumpster sat right in the middle of the pristine circular driveway, completely filled with shattered Italian marble, torn silk wallpaper, and broken mahogany paneling. Two men in hard hats were currently swinging heavy sledgehammers into the sweeping double staircase of the grand foyer, literally smashing Beatrice's arrogant legacy into unrecognizable rubble. Every loud crack of the hammers echoed like music to my ears. I was not just remodeling a house, I was performing an exorcism. I was stripping every single trace of their toxic, elitist taste from existence. I watched as another contractor carried out the twisted metal remains of the massive crystal chandelier that had hung over the formal dining room table, the exact table I was told I was not classy enough to sit at, tossing it unceremoniously into the trash. The house that had once served as a fortress to lock me out and make me feel small was now stripped down to bare, honest wooden studs. It was a blank canvas ready for me to build a home filled with genuine warmth, completely free from the suffocating weight of their judgment. I took another sip of wine and stepped up to the very edge of the balcony, looking directly into the camera. My journey over the last few months had completely transformed me. The exhausted, grieving widow, who had stood weeping in the freezing rain at the cemetery, was gone forever. I looked at the audience speaking with a calm, unshakable confidence. They really thought they could bury me in a mountain of fabricated debt and frame me for their massive federal crimes. I said, my voice steady and clear. They thought they could use my pristine professional license as a shield, treating me like a naive, disposable pawn, while they escaped to a life of limitless luxury in Europe. They completely underestimated my intelligence, my resilience, and my absolute refusal to be a victim. But mostly, they forgot one cardinal rule of both business and warfare. Never ever let your enemies see the ledger. I smiled, thinking of Jamal, Nolan, Rebecca, and Beatrice sitting in their tiny cold concrete cells. They had traded their bespoke suits and designer gowns for standard-issue prison uniforms. They were completely stripped of the wealth, the status, and the absolute power that had defined their entire existence. The Golden family was entirely broken, locked away for decades, while I was standing on the balcony of their seized castle, breathing in the fresh, free air. They spent 5 long years trying to convince me that I was a worthless, working-class charity case who was incredibly lucky to be allowed into their prestigious world. They systematically gaslit me, exhausted me, and tried to make me feel incredibly small, so I would never realize how heavily their entire empire relied on my strength and my skills. I took a deep breath, feeling fully empowered, incredibly wealthy, and finally truly free. I looked straight through the lens, delivering my final message to anyone listening who had ever been made to feel less than by the people who were supposed to love them. If your family ever tells you that you are worth nothing, I said, do not cry and do not believe them. Check the receipts. Look at the facts. You might just be the absolute most valuable person in the room. I raised my crystal wine glass in a final victorious toast to the empty, gutted estate behind me and to the brilliant future ahead. And remember, the absolute sweetest revenge is living spectacularly well, entirely on their dime. Fade to black. The harrowing story of Clara's survival and ultimate triumph serves as a profound masterclass in recognizing your inherent value, especially when the people closest to you are determined to diminish it. For 5 years, Clara's husband and his family subjected her to severe emotional manipulation and gaslighting. They mocked her working-class background, treated her hard-earned professional skills as mere utility, and tried to convince her that she was lucky just to be permitted at their dinner table. This reflects a dangerous dynamic found in many toxic relationships. Manipulators will eagerly drain your resources, your time, your money, and your love, while simultaneously trying to convince you that you are completely worthless. The greatest lesson we can take from Clara's journey is that we must never allow other people to be the authors of our reality. Clara's turning point did not come from begging for her in-laws' approval or trying to prove her worth to people committed to despising her. Her victory came the moment she stopped listening to their lies and started trusting her own expertise. The very skills her family sneered at, her meticulous accounting and dedication to the truth, became the exact tools she used to dismantle their entire empire. Toxic people will often try to minimize your greatest strengths, precisely because those strengths are what make you a threat to their control. Ultimately, Clara teaches us that true empowerment means looking objectively at the ledger of our own lives, acknowledging our undeniable contributions, and refusing to be a sacrificial lamb for someone else's ego or legacy. Your worth is not up for negotiation. If you have ever felt undervalued by those around you, take a moment today to recognize your own strengths, set unbreakable boundaries, and share this story with someone who needs a reminder of their own power.